But as I say, this isn't a sort of straight line process. There are lots of factors that go into the inflation figures. And that's why the government, working very closely with the Bank of England, are very determined by the decisions we make around public spending, around pay settlements.
How long is UK media going to allow the government to get away with this absolute bollocks? After more than a decade of almost completely unprecedented wage stagnation, workers in the UK are £11,000 a year worse off. 2022 was the worst year for real wage growth in nearly half a century. Average real wages in the UK will actually be lower in 2026 than they were in 2008. Just think about that. So on what planet can it be said wage rises for public sector workers are causing high inflation?
The best way for me to help everyone is to bring inflation down, as I'm determined to do. And that requires me to make some decisions, whether it's on public sector pay.
How about pointing out that according to the International Monetary Fund, it was rising corporate profits which were the largest contributor to Europe's inflation over the past 2 years, as companies increased prices by more than the spiking costs of imported energy. So just when the Prime Minister should be targeting corporate greed, his shameless government has once again declared war on working people by imposing yet more crappy real terms pay cuts on public sector workers.
The worst thing that we could do domestically would be to significantly increase public sector pay and then entrench inflation.
How many times do I have to point this out? It's not rocket science. If a private sector company increases its wages, yes, that goes directly into the cost of making that product or service, and that might end up increasing the price. But that's not the case with public sector workers, such as healthcare, which are free at the point of use. That means consumers don't pay for them directly, so they don't affect the inflation statistics. Don't just take my word for this. Listen to Stephanie Flanders, an expert economist and head of Bloomberg News Economics, speaking to the BBC's Laura Kunsberg.
They're concerned that inflation, which we know is putting so much pressure on people, will be bumped further up if they hand over lots more money to the public sector. As a very expert economist, does that stack up?
It is not something that economists tend to agree with, I'm sorry, because it is very different. If you have a private sector company increase its wages, well, that goes directly into the cost of making that product or service and may well then end up meaning they have to increase the price in the shops. Obviously, that's not the case with public sector workers. There isn't a price that's going to go up. Of course, there's a bill to be paid, and one always would have to ask questions about where the money's going to come from. Is it going to squeeze other things in the health? If it's going to increase health spending, which would mean it was additional, obviously there is an additional demand on the economy which could potentially increase inflation at the margins. But I think this equivalence, people understand that if a private sector company raises wages, that's going to add to costs and to prices. It just isn't the same thing for public sector workers. And when you've had the kind of gap that's opened up since 2010 between public and private sector workers in terms of their pay, even with the difference of conditions and other things, that is in itself an issue in terms of morale and in terms of the sort of stability of the system.
And remember, the public sector labour force makes up only about 17% of the total workforce, so it has much less of an impact on the economy than the private sector. So when the government cites this as a reason for not giving our public sector workers the fair pay rise we all know they deserve.
The worst thing that we could do domestically would be to significantly increase public sector pay.
Please remember, they are again talking complete bollocks. Increasing public sector wages will not push up inflation in any significant way, and most economists agree. And the government knows it. Its refusal to pay our public sector workers what they're worth is just another one of this government's shameless political choices.